moved around the fens on a series of wooden causeways. The weapons were always discovered near these causeways. At first it was assumed they were accidentally dropped or lost in battle. In fact, there is a far more mysterious explanation.
People were visiting the river, using the river, and for whatever reason, they were leaving this sort of material. The spear could have been used in the river, but it seems to have been given to the river.
And I like the idea of them being given and returned to the waters, perhaps.
And these medieval iron swords, the sword theme does actually go all the way through millennia.
For hundreds of years, weapons have been deliberately thrown from these causeways into the water. I believe that the story of King Arthur receiving his sword Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake is a direct reference to this ancient British tradition. But the Arthurian legends were written much later, long after these ancient religious ideas were supposedly wiped out by the Romans and Christianity. How on earth did they survive? The Witham had one more secret to reveal.
This area of Fenland is one of the highest concentrations of monastic sites anywhere in Britain. There can be no practical need for so many abbeys in such a small area. So why was the early medieval church building here with such extraordinary fervour?
The narrow 10-mile stretch of the Witham Valley is scattered with the remains of 14 abbeys. Every one of these abbeys is built at the end of an ancient causeway.
We found it really difficult to understand why there should be 14 church sites, all lined up for 10 miles, along the edge of the Witham Valley.
Historians Dave Stocker and Paul Everson don't think that this is a coincidence.
The abbey we are standing on is on an island. You find there's only one way to get here, and it's along a causeway.
It seems odd, but a causeway should determine where you're going to put an abbey.
You've got to bear in mind that to cross any sort of body of water, but particularly to cross a fen by boat, was a dangerous matter. And in order to make it a successful crossing, you had to offer some sort of piety. Some sort of, call it superstition, but it was a sort of folk superstition which was bound up with religion.
The weapons and the water into which they were being placed had significance for the people of ancient Britain.
Swords weren't just a weapon. The sword is a great symbol of authority, which is distributed outwards from lords to their tenants as a badge of office. Once the tenant dies, that sword has to go back to the lord, and that's attested in many Anglo-Saxon wills. Now, imagine that you're a king and you haven't got a lord, or at least not on earth. And in the Arthur story, of course, it's the Spirit of the Lake, it's the Lady of the Lake, who is the guardian of Britain.
The story of the Lady in the Lake echoes the ancient tradition of depositing weapons in water. The medieval authors who wrote these tales knew about such traditions because Christianity had not killed them off, but had kept them alive.
When were the last swords going in?
Well, the latest one is 14th century. And interestingly enough, that's precisely the same moment at which swords and indeed whole body armour tend to start being hung up in churches over burials of lords.
I mean, it sounds to me, looking at it as a prehistorian, that actually what some of these chaps in the abbeys are doing sounds awfully sort of pagan to me.
Pope Gregory has said, I don't want you knocking down these pagan temples, I want you converting the pagan idols. Water is the one connecting thread. The Bronze Age barrows were by the water. The causeways crossed the water. The swords are put into the water. So the one connecting thread of all this is water.
And do you suppose that might be a reason why that fantastic cathedral over there is placed right by the River Witham?
I have very little doubt that that's the case. The first name for Lincoln is Indo-Colne, city by the pool. Nicor is what the Normans tended to call the place. And the word Nicor means water spirit.
The story of the Witham is one of continuity. It suggests that deep-rooted ideas that began in prehistory continued well into the medieval period. This clashes with what I learnt at school, where the first 1,000 years of British history were a series of massive invasions.
Indeed, the first of these, the Roman invasion, may not have been a tale about a boy and a magical sword. I found evidence that ancient British traditions survived the Roman invasion. A new series of archaeological discoveries are beginning to rewrite the story of the Roman invasion of Britain.
This elegant mosaic decorated the floor of one of the most luxurious buildings in Roman Britain. But this was not the overseas residence of some extravagant Roman governor, but the home of a wealthy, Romanized Brit.
Fishbourne Palace is the largest building ever excavated in Roman Britain. Martin Hennig helped excavate the gardens.
It was absolutely amazing. Digging along, your trowel couldn't help sinking in, and you were actually uncovering the bedding trenches, probably for box. You can see similar gardens on a much smaller scale if you go to Pompeii.
On a smaller scale?
Yes. What you've got here is something that's equivalent to the palaces of the greatest Roman aristocrats.
Fishbourne covers a larger area than Buckingham Palace. 160 stone columns support the roof, which is constructed from 100 tons of imported Italian tiles. Corridors surround over 100 rooms, some of which are decorated with elaborate mosaics. When Fishbourne was discovered, it was assumed that this was the palace of a Roman governor, a symbol of the imperial regime that had been forced on Britain. But during excavations, archaeologists came across a gold signet ring with an unusual inscription, the seal of Tiberius Claudius Catuarus. The ring belonged to a wealthy Briton. But what was it doing at Fishbourne? To understand why a Briton might be living in a Roman palace, we must look again at the events leading up to the invasion of AD 43.
Maybe because we haven't been invaded since 1066, we British have a simplistic attitude towards invasions. We see them as being inevitably oppressive. So we imagine that when the Romans arrived, they wiped out British culture and customs. But in actual fact, it wasn't a straightforward process of colonization.
Archaeologists are starting to radically rethink the Roman invasion of Britain.
I would imagine the Britons faced by the might of Rome would have been quaking in their boots.
I don't think it was quite that. The previous attempt to invade Britain was that of the bad and mad Emperor Caligula, who had marched a large army up to the Channel coast. He then put all his catapults in a row, and they fired enormous rocks into the sea. After a time, he told them that he had won a great victory over Nechen. You can imagine how that got about. The great Roman Empire was run by a lot of Charlies, and it completely destabilized the situation, of course.
Pre-Roman Britain was in fact a collection of often feuding tribal kingdoms. There is very little written evidence about early British tribes, but John Crichton showed me a burial from the period which contained some intriguing items.
Lexington Tumulus is a burial found just outside Colchester. It dates to about 10 BC, so this is still about 50, 60 years before the Roman conquest. Containers of Roman wine, small little Cupid, bronze work coming in from the Italian world. This stuff just isn't being produced in Britain at all. Here's a small little medallion of the Roman emperor, the Emperor Augustus. So a really nice personal gift from the emperor.
But why would an Iron Age king in Britain want to have a Roman emperor's head in his grave?
They're associating themselves with Rome. It's like all the satellite states around the Soviet Union or the influence America had in Central America. Big, powerful empires have very, very close relations with all the states around them.
Certain tribal leaders in Britain had been friendly with Rome for decades before the invasion. Their coins reflect the glory of the empire.
Coinage is never politically neutral. It's always saying something, it's always meaning something. It has its own native style to start with. But then, around about the time of this kind of burial, we start finding classical imagery appearing on the coins.
So they would have been familiar with classical literature?
Certainly the upper tier, yes. And that can't be a coincidence. The kings in Britain are very tightly bound in with the power politics in Rome. We see them adopting the same imagery, again showing their affiliation to the New World Order.
There was one British king known as Verrica, who was on particularly good terms with Rome. His tribe was the Atrebates. In the most complete version of the Roman invasion, the historian Cassius Dio describes Verrica inviting the Roman troops in.
A certain Verrica had persuaded the Emperor Claudius to send a force to Britain, led by the distinguished Senator Plautius.
This wasn't a subservient relationship. Verrica would help the Romans if he was able to do so, and that they would help him if need be.
In AD 43, the need did arise when Verrica's kingdom was invaded.
The Atrebates had been effectively under military occupation by tribes from the north.
That rather implies that, to people down here at least, the Romans weren't that unwelcome.
The Romans arrived as liberators.
This is a revolutionary idea, but can it be supported by archaeology? Cassius Dio on the invasion.
On the way across, they were first discouraged, but they recovered when they saw a flash of light cross the sky from east to west, the direction they were traveling. When the fleet reached the island, there was no one to oppose them.
Dio, however, omits to mention where the invasion took place.
Why was I taught as a student that the Romans landed in large numbers on the Kentish shore at Richborough?
There had been excavations at Richborough which certainly discovered some early military evidence. They looked at the 3rd century account and added topographical details so that a battle on the Medway became almost a historical fact, though actually the River Medway is nowhere mentioned.
So archaeologists invented it?
Yes, it's a total invention.
If the Romans didn't arrive at Richborough, where did they land? There is another possible site for the Roman invasion, Chichester Harbour, slap bang in the middle of Verrica's territory.
This is a fairly typical tidal creek. What makes it special?
It's nice and sheltered, a wonderful natural harbour, which would have allowed large numbers of men to be disembarked.
Yes. If you had a Roman invasion arriving here, what sort of number of boats?
Perhaps 200 or 300. Yeah. So a large number of boats that would need to be manoeuvred.
Chichester Harbour is in fact right next to Fishbourne Palace. So was the palace anything to do with King Verrica? The palace was built 30 years after the invasion. However, recent finds of ceramics have revealed that there was a base at Fishbourne